Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
See You on the Other Side, episode 150.
Oh my gosh, 150 episodes. That calls for celebration.
150.
That's amazing, you
That's
guys.
right.
We should have
Thank
brought
you.
the champagne today.
Well, instead we're bringing the box wine. So, cheers to everybody for 150 episodes and frequent
Yay.
guest and fellow
Cheers.
Wisconsin weirdo joining us tonight. And this is exciting. So our sesquicentennial episode is featuring one of our favorite authors and writers, and that is our friend Mark O'Connell. Hi, Mark. How you doing?
Hi, everybody. I'm doing great.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome back
It's
to
good
the
to be
show.
here.
And we're so excited for you because you've had a huge book release in June of this year. And the Close Encounters, man, I remember when you first started talking about this 2 years ago, and the first time we talked and had you on the show, you talked about J. Allen Hynek, the good doctor. And first of all, congratulations on the publication of the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats.
Thanks.
Congrats.
And number two, thank you. We know you've been really obviously busy on all kinds of media. You were just on WGN last week, right?
Yeah, on Friday morning.
Yeah, that's huge.
That was fun.
And then just on Coast to Coast AM, like just
Yeah.
there, right? Like 2 days ago.
Sunday night, yeah. Sunday night from midnight to 2.
And was that George Knapp interviewing you on Sunday?
Yeah,
Yes,
it was.
George Knapp, like a Scirocco.
Like a Scirocco from the desert.
Yes, that's the guy. That's the
I
guy.
love him.
And what's exciting about being interviewed by George Knapp, too, is he's the guy that, I mean, we wouldn't have Area 51 without him.
Mhm.
Well, we wouldn't have our knowledge of Area 51.
Right. Our so-called knowledge of Area 51. Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
he broke that original story.
Uh-huh.
So let's just get right in and start talking about J. Allen. Now, we're going to talk to you about all those interviews and your favorite and the dumbest questions you received from non-UFO fans and everything in just a minute. But first of all, to anybody who doesn't know who J. Allen Hynek is, let's give him a quick refresher course on the good doctor and also how you got interested in him in the first place.
Okay. J. Allen Hynek was a professional astronomer and college professor teaching at the Ohio State University and Ohio Wesleyan Universities right at the time that the modern UFO era began, exactly 70 years ago this month. When UFOs started popping up all over the skies around North America, the Air Force was in a complete bind. They couldn't explain what was going on. They were losing public confidence. They were trying to explain away every UFO sighting as something perfectly natural, but they needed a scientist to back them up on that and give them some cover. So the UFO researchers for the Air Force, who were at Wright-Patterson Field, drove up the highway to where Dr. Hynek taught. He was already a known quantity because he had done some high-security government work during World War II. And they recruited him to join their project, at the time called Project Sign. And he had exactly one job. They would give him a pile of UFO reports, and he would go through report by report and say, oh, yeah, this one, that's obviously a misidentification of the planet Venus. That one is obviously a comet. This one's obviously a meteor. And one by one, he would knock down all of these UFO reports. But there were always 20% left over that he couldn't knock down. And that kind of becomes the key to his whole story. He left the UFO trade for a couple of years, went back to teaching. 3 years later, 1952, the Air Force calls him up again. They need him again because the UFOs keep appearing. And Hynek says, sure, I'll come back. But as he agrees to come back, he kind of has to admit to himself, holy crap, I can't believe people are still seeing UFOs 3 years later. And then he starts looking through the newer files and he realizes, oh man, there are still 20% of these reports that can't be explained. So all of a sudden that 20% is a problem to him. And that's what sort of started this long, slow process of him changing his mind and converting from diehard skeptic to a true believer.
Well, I love that you mentioned the planet Venus because that always makes me think of the X-Files episode with the Men in Black when Jesse the Body Ventura and Alex Trebek show up as Men in Black. Jose Chung's from outer space.
Oh, that's my favorite episode of all time.
Right, and then what happens is somebody sees a UFO and Jesse the Body Ventura is just like, what you saw was the planet Venus. And when you said that, I pictured Jesse the Body as Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and things got really weird in the alternate history of my mind.
I bet.
Yeah.
As they do.
So he was like picked by the military to investigate these things. And he had a more open mind than, we think a lot of people probably do have today. And it took him a while to get around to that. What inspired you to maybe want to tell his story? Like, why did you think like Dr. Hynek was someone that we just haven't heard enough about?
Well, there were two things about Hynek that really intrigued me and that and made me want to tell his story. And the first one was the fact that he had this illustrious career as a UFO expert that, obviously all us UFO enthusiasts are familiar with. But he also had this really impressive career as an astronomer, and he accomplished an awful lot of really radical, amazing things as an astronomer that I never knew about. So I figured a lot of people never knew about those either. So the first thing that intrigued me was just this duality of his career, astronomer and UFO hunter. And I thought it was a cool story to look at how those two different careers informed each other over time. So that was the first hook for me. The second hook was a story that a lot of us are probably more familiar with, and that is the whole the position Hynek found himself in 1966 after the Michigan swamp gas case, when Hynek was basically hated by both sides of the UFO community. The Air Force was angry with him because he was no longer covering for them. He was no longer willing to explain away and debunk all the UFO reports. But at the same time, the UFO community was furious with him because they felt that he still was helping to cover up for the Air Force. So here's this guy in this completely impossible decision. He's trying to sort of straddle the line between the skeptics and the believers and not commit to one side or the other and remain open-minded and objective. And he's just getting crucified for it on both sides. So those were the two hooks that really grabbed me and made me want to tell his story.
And you do go over the Michigan swamp gas case in an earlier episode of the show, but maybe we can get a Reader's Digest version real quick of why that's a famous case for UFO nerds like myself.
Sure. Well, it was one of the few UFO cases that really made national headlines. So that's the first big thing about it. All over Southeast Michigan in March 1966, a whole bunch of people were seeing strange lights in the sky. All the sightings came to a head one weekend when first a farm family saw them in this swampland behind their farm, and then the next night, a whole bunch of college students saw the same lights in their college arboretum outside their dorm. Well, when you've got, all told, they had over 100 witnesses, including law enforcement officers, college professors, the local civil defense agent. So you've got this immense body of witnesses all describing very similar lights in the sky and on the ground. It became a huge, huge national event. Hynek comes in. He's being pressured by his bosses at the Air Force to come up with a quick solution so they can stamp this story out and get it off the national headlines. And at the end of 3 days of investigating, Hynek has a press conference, and he says, well, while I couldn't prove it in a court of law, the objects these people all described seeing sound an awful lot like swamp gas. And it just created this huge furor. Everyone in Michigan was furious with Hynek because they felt he was, making fun of them all.
Well, he did work in Ohio and stuff. So, I mean, and he, spent a lot of time in Illinois. It wouldn't be weird if he wanted to make fun of the people from Michigan.
The Midwest rivalry.
Yeah.
But it does kind of sound like just blowing it off,
Yeah.
Yep, it was swamp gas.
Yeah, I know. That is definitely what it sounded like. But, I researched the hell out of this case. I devoted 2 chapters of the book to it. And I came to the conclusion that Hynek said exactly the right thing.
Well, I think acid was still legal in 1966, though, too. Like, it wasn't, I mean, those college kids in the 60s were naughty.
The college kids, it was like 87 young women in a girls' dormitory at Hillsdale College, and they had names like Gidget and Pinky.
Oh, man.
Oh, you can't make that up.
You know that-
great.
You know that every Air Force officer was like raising his hand to go on that particular, it's like, yo, I'll ask him questions. I gotta go.
I gotta go talk to Gidget.
Yeah.
I'd like to interview Binky personally.
So, Mark, this is Allison from Milwaukee Ghost. And, hey, I was wondering, when did you first learn about J. Allen Hynek? I know for me, it was probably the Close Encounters movie. The title of that, came from his designations. And then also, like, seeing him, I think most people don't realize that he's in that movie as a cameo. And, but you've probably... All of you out there, if you've seen Close Encounters, you've probably seen him. He's just such an iconic figure. With his white hair and beard and pipe. He just looks like.
I thought he was the mashed
academics. No, he's not the mashed potatoes. He looks like one of those academics of old.
Absolutely, and I couldn't tell you. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when or where I first heard of him. But I know you, Mike and Allison, I'm sure you probably spent some time at the Big Bend Village Library.
Yeah,
we did.
I read all 60 books there.
Yeah.
I can't believe we didn't run into each other there.
Well, my mom was a volunteer librarian there, and some nights she would take me with her when she worked at the library. So I would be stuck in this little library for, 3 hours.
What a great place to be stuck.
Well, I know. I appreciate it more now than I did then.
Of course.
But I always gravitated toward the bookshelf that had the books about, Chariots of the Gods, Bermuda Triangle, Poltergeist, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, and of course UFOs. So I just, whatever handful of books they had there dealing with the topic, I read those over and over and over again. So I'm pretty sure that was probably the first time I ever heard of Dr. Hynek and his work. And that would have been like when I was maybe 6 or 7 or 8, pretty young.
All right. It's just so weird that we're all like probably reading the same copies.
Right.
You were probably the ones that always had them checked out when I wanted to get them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right.
And I was the one who'd always return it with like scratch marks and like pencil things and like things I underlined and stuff like that. Yeah, I was always the goofus and not the gallant.
Oh, man.
But the Close Encounters thing, that's a particular kind of classification of a alien, or excuse me, not. There I am going to the extraterrestrial hypothesis right away again. My biases show. So, Mark, what is the Close Encounters classification system? What does it mean? Just in case people out there don't know.
Well, first of all, the Close Encounters classification system was actually Dr. Hynek's third attempt at a classification system. His first attempt was in the 60s, and he came up with this idea where you would categorize UFO events by the strangeness, the high strangeness of the event, and by the reliability of the witness. That was his first stab at it. A couple of years later, he worked that into something where he had three main categories of sightings, and those were daylight discs, meandering nocturnal lights, and visual/radar sightings. From there, he added on the close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, those 3 classifications. And those are simply close encounter. The first kind is you're making visual contact with an unidentified object within 500 yards or so. He figured that was close enough that you could make out physical detail, like, size and shape and outline. Close encounter, the second kind, same thing, only in this case, there are the UFO leaves behind physical traces. So that could mean scorch marks on the ground or landing pad imprints, or it could mean that the UFO knocked out your car's engine and headlights, or gave you retina burns. All those things have been reported numerous times. And then third kind really ups the ante and includes UFO occupants, most of the time humanoid. But yeah, creatures or entities that are associated with the UFO or come from the UFO And in those cases, the witness either has visual contact or actually interacts with those beings.
That's the one we want to avoid. I mean,
Yeah.
some of us don't want to avoid.
Right,
Some of us want to encourage, but
Yeah.
that's the one I want to avoid.
We want to be careful what we wish for.
Right.
I want the non-probe kind.
Yes.
There is a fourth kind as well, right? Was that Jay Allen's, or was that added on?
That was added on. The fourth, I think there is a fourth kind and a fifth kind now, and I think they involve abductions and
the probing Mike was talking
the probing, all that Whitney Strieber kind of stuff. Yeah.
That's right. The getting up close and personal.
Right. That's
Extra personal.
Extra.
interspecies relations. But the thing is, when we think about, Dr. Hynek was working with Project Blue Book during some of the very famous UFO cases throughout the 1960s. And I was wondering some of his investigation style. Did he just look at the reports? Did he send Air Force people to do it? Did he have psychiatrists or psychologists working? When we think about today, if you would run a UFO operation, you'd want a psychiatrist. You'd want to have an investigator that knows how to interrogate people. On a ghost TV show, you'd bring a psychic along just so you get your share of BS. But what was the investigation style when they were doing Project Blue Book back in the old? I'm picturing Joe Friday from Dragnet, walking up to a terrified person, doesn't care if they're going through PTSD or whatever, just to let me have it. So what was it like?
Well, Hynek definitely had a Joe Friday approach. He was Mr. Just the Facts Man. But his work with Project Blue Book, though, you ask what their investigative style was like. It was so bare bones and so rudimentary. There was the Air Force officer in charge of Project Blue Book was always a very low-ranking officer who did not have much power. There was never much of a budget. They operated out of a couple of just really rundown offices at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And Hynek really, for the most part, had no say in how a case was studied. He considered himself lucky if the Air Force would actually send him out to the site of the event just so that he could investigate it firsthand. That didn't always happen. A lot of times he was kind of stuck, interviewing the witnesses days or weeks after the fact, because that was as soon as he could get there. The Air Force has lots of planes, but they always made Hynek travel commercial air when he needed to go someplace. Their approach was pretty counterproductive, I guess you could say. So Hynek was always kind of sort of working his way against the way the Air Force was trying to operate. One of the fun stories I learned that I mentioned in the book is that he had this really great assistant, Jenny Zeidman, who worked with him for a long, long time. And whenever somebody would call them directly at the Ohio State University to report a UFO sighting, Dr. Hynek would say, "Okay, that's cool, but now could you call this office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and report it to them? Because if you report it to them, they might pay for us to investigate it. But if you report it to us, they won't." So, he and Zeidman sort of worked out these little ways to work the system to try to get, just a little bit more resources, but it didn't always work.
Well, I'm also wondering too, did he have I'm thinking about, he was knee deep in the UFO stuff during the Betty and Barney Hill incident.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, I had never heard, you hear the regression tapes of Barney Hill and they're terrifying and things like that, but I'd never heard if the Air Force or Project Blue Book had ever investigated that. Was there ever an official investigation by those guys of that particular incident? Now, if you guys at home are playing along, Betty and Barney Hill were a couple in the 1960s that this is the first internationally famous UFO abduction missing time incident that kind of penetrated the national consciousness.
Yeah. If there was an official airport investigation, they kept it very well hidden, because this kind of case was a case that involved not just UFO occupants, but an abduction and missing time. Was an embarrassment to everyone. It was an embarrassment to the Air Force, and it was an embarrassment to Hynek, because it just became so much harder to explain and so much harder to take seriously. So at the beginning, I think it was just the day after Betty and Barney had their interrupted journey, Betty actually contacted the local Air Force base and report. Yeah, and Betty and Barney spent some time on the phone with an officer at the Air Force Base, and he heard them out. They have no idea if he recorded anything or if he started a file on them or anything, but he basically heard them out, and it went no further. And Betty and Barney really did not do anything with their memories of that event for a couple of years, as you probably know. It took them a couple of years before they decided that they needed to, maybe see a hypnotist to try to figure out what the heck happened to them that night. So yeah, that was a case where the Air Force may well have investigated, but if they did, they kept it very, very well hidden.
They just don't want to know what they found.
Well, yeah, I mean, why would they?
Thinking about famous cases, and we're talking about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Before that, did anybody from Hollywood ever approach Dr. Hynek for maybe some research or ideas for a movie or anything? Was he on set for anything, or did he start hanging out in those circles a little bit to, make extra money, or just because he loves celebs or whatever?
Before the Spielberg movie, no. I never saw any indication that he was ever involved in anything like that. And I think if you would have asked him in the 50s or 60s about anything like that, he probably would have just laughed in your face. He probably would have thought that was a pretty unseemly thing for a college professor to do, to get involved in movie making. There were some movie making tie-ins. There was a guy named Donald Kehoe who wrote a couple of best-selling UFO conspiracy paperbacks in the 1950s. And one of Kehoe's books was, even though it was a nonfiction, supposedly a nonfiction book about real UFO events, Columbia Pictures bought the rights to it, and it was turned into this nifty little Ray Harryhausen movie called Earth versus the Flying Saucers that you may recall from your childhood. Yeah. So that's the one direct Hollywood tie-in that I know of, but it didn't involve Hynek.
Okay. So Dr. Hynek is a fascinating guy, but Mark, when you were coming to it as a, researcher, somebody who's been interested in this stuff, you've had your UFO blog for a little bit. In fact, your Twitter handle is Mark UFO Connell.
Yeah.
So obviously, and you've had a lifelong interest in this, and we've discussed that before. Kind of explain to the audience. So the people that are listening, when they're thinking about picking up the book or reading it, they're thinking about what's the perspective of the author, right? Because that really does shape a lot of how the story goes. Mm-hmm. So where would you put yourself on the UFO level, let's say between Carl Sagan and Giorgio?
Giorgio's too close. Where are you in the crazy spectrum?
In the continuum.
I have to answer this one very carefully. I would. I'm obviously more on the Giorgio side of things. I don't know how far. I don't know if that can be measured. But I'm more on the Giorgio side of things than the Carl Sagan side of things, for sure.
And that's funny because we were just talking about this, and I think you blogged about it a little bit this week or last week, that Alejandro Rojas from Open Minds labeled you a skeptic. And first of all, as a guy that just wrote a book on Dr. Hynek, and that's written science fiction and has been interested in this stuff, being labeled as you're the representative from the Committee for the Scientific Investigation for Claims of the Paranormal or whatever, seems like are you calling me a traitor, pal? But what kind of happened there?
Well, that's how I took it. Well, there was some chatter on a Facebook group. I think it was, oh gosh. Was it the UFO Digest? No, that's not it. At any rate, there are numerous UFO interest groups on Facebook. And
Facebook is the place where we have reasonable conversations every day.
Right.
We're all on our best behavior.
So a discussion was, somebody posted something in one of these communities about an old speech that Dr. Hynek had given. And in the comments that followed, people were mentioning, this guy Mark O'Connell just wrote a book about Dr. Hynek. We should all read it. And at that point, Alejandro Rojas chimed in on the comment section and said, I'm talking with Mark about doing an interview with him. I think he's kind of a skeptic. And I saw that, and I just I really reacted badly because I have seen that term skeptic used as, a bat to beat people on the head with. If you're a skeptic,
insult, yeah.
you're the enemy. You're closed-minded, you're ignorant, you're not willing to accept new ideas, and you're an enemy to UFO culture. That's how I took it. And so I wrote a blog post about that. Well, I'm happy to say Alejandro read the blog post. He read some more of the comments on Facebook, and he wrote to me and he said, "Hey, you've got this wrong. That's not what I'm trying to call you."
Oh, that's good.
Well, that's good.
Well, I was hoping we'd have some kind of rap culture beef or whatever between Mark and Alejandro. And obviously, we'd have to rep Wisconsin over here. We'd be like, "What's up, yo?"
Everybody takes sides.
Alejandro Rojas is just seems like, I haven't met him, but he just seems strikes me as the sweetest guy. So, for
cool.
my mind, I'm just thinking that maybe he's trying to reclaim that term of skeptic, rather than, using as any kind of epithet.
Well, yeah, I that's kind of the feeling I got from him when he responded to me, was that he was simply trying to say that I'm somebody who I have filters. That's the way I'd like to describe it. I have filters. There's a lot of stuff I'll believe, but there's some things that I just won't believe either because I have filters. And I try to look at things critically. So Alejandro what he ended up saying was that that's what he was trying to describe. So we're all good now. And I'm going to do a talk with him later this week. So that should be fun. Yeah.
So everybody can listen to you on Open Minds as well on your podcast.
It does bring up an interesting point about the use of, the term skeptic and how, like you were saying, in this community, it kind of has a different connotation sometimes.
I think the term will need a lot more rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's going to take a lot more.
It's good for us to deal with that because, I think, people who are outside of the community, maybe they don't understand the kind of rivalry that goes on.
Yeah.
And the so-called skeptics. I think people really want to reclaim that term because, a lot of the people out there who claim skepticism are, if you look critically at it, it seems that they're really cynics. It seems that they really want to just debunk, and anything that doesn't neatly fit into the materialist worldview, they just want to discount totally. Even though phenomena is there, to deny it is to put your head in the sand. So I think this really needs to be addressed. So I'm glad that this happened in a way because maybe you could have been talking about it on Open Minds, the whole whether you're truly a skeptic or not. Because I would think when you have filters, that's the true meaning of skepticism.
But taking the other side of it, and I totally agree with you, Allison. But I will say that sometimes I appreciate the skeptics because oftentimes, when I want to look at something that has a paranormal story to it or something, the skeptics are the one that will actually have true history, reports and things like that, as opposed to the whimsical, fun, the stuff that I want to believe.
Right.
But I like to make sure, a lot of times with folklore, for example, I'll just give you an example of that case was when I went to visit Stull Cemetery. That has a long history of stories about the devil coming out on Halloween and all kinds of paranormal phenomena there. And I wanted to know, where did this all originate? And, it turned out I found it on a skeptic's site. Sorry to say, but, they had they thought there was a professor at the university who had been teaching folklore and he was doing an experiment to try to see if he could start a legend himself. Yeah. So. Now, whether that's true or whether there's more to it, I don't know. But I found that particularly interesting and helpful in my own research.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and skeptic websites, are a valuable resource. Well, let's hear what Mark has to say about this.
Yeah.
Well,
I think you and I, Wendy, could go on this.
We definitely could.
Well, I was thinking what Wendy was saying got me thinking that there's this irony that the explanations that a skeptic will come up with to explain an unusual phenomenon are often just as wigged out as the explanations that we come up with. And you know what I mean when I say wigged out? I just mean they're just as extreme, just as implausible or improbable or whatever word you want to use.
True.
They're not, they're very often, they're not any more fact-based or reliable than what the true believers come up with. I'm trying to think of an example. Well, here's an example. Okay, now I have problems with the whole Roswell UFO mythology. I've written about that a lot on my blog. It's not a favorite case of mine. I think there are a lot of problems with it. But then you've also got the Air Force publishing their rebuttals to the Roswell story and saying, well, those bodies were really crash test dummies that we dropped out of the sky to see how they would survive, like falling out of a aircraft or whatever their story was. And it's kind of like, come on, you guys, this has got to be a put on. It's like, if you're going to explain something away, your explanation needs to make more sense than the other guy's explanation. And in that case, it really didn't. So they don't do themselves any favors.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, I think about that when Bill Clinton was talking about Roswell. And I mean, you always had to worry, like, what's coming out of his mouth, like, because he's a smooth talking guy. So you always gotta be like, okay, like, what does he want here? And does he want to? He's just like, well, we looked into it for the 50th anniversary, and just a weather balloon,
Right.
And,
well, I think
he's just like, oh yeah.
I think he's still trying to figure out what the meaning of the word is. So, I think he says,
I did not have sexual relations with that alien.
That's right, Bill. We believe you.
Well, this question came up the other day in another interview. Somebody brought up the whole John Podesta thing and how Hillary Clinton went on the Jimmy Kimmel show during the campaign and promised that if she was elected president, she would immediately sign an executive order, commanding the Air Force to release everything they know. And I said, look, we heard that for 8 years while Bill Clinton was, we didn't hear it for 8 years. At the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, suddenly John Podesta pops up and says, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't take advantage of being in the White House and really demand that all this information be released. 8 years later, Barack Obama's in the White House. John Podesta's on his staff again. Dude keeps his mouth shut for 8 more years. And then when his job's almost over, he says, oh gosh, I really wish I had done something when I had a chance to reveal all that information. I just feel like, John Podesta, shut up.
I really wish I had the presidents here. I really wish I knew the most powerful people on the planet, and I could ask them about aliens.
Yeah, what a shame. It didn't work out.
Yeah. I just didn't think of it when I watched Independence Day.
What do you think is going on there? This seems like an itch we should scratch.
It seems to me maybe John Podesta knows this is an easy way to get headlines. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. I can't see what's in his heart, Allison. I can't. I'm not sure if I want to.
But it's good to be skeptical of that because, Hillary was on. She really said she's going to look into it. Yeah. And you're like, you're not going to look. You were already there. Hillary, you obviously the one cutting up the alien bodies. Like, we know it.
She was going for the paranormal vote.
Right.
That's right.
Which is a pretty big vote.
It is, yeah.
Well, there is something to it because I tell you, I spent a lot of time on Twitter following and meeting new people who are into Coast to Coast AM, who are into aliens, who are into ghosts and things like that. And it's disclosure truthers and things like that. And a lot of the people who, they'll say something about aliens and the next thing will say, #Make America Great Again. And like, in an election that was decided by a few dozen thousand or tens of thousands of votes, like in Ohio and Wisconsin and things like that could have switched either way. When you're telling somebody they're going to get disclosure, you might get that guy to sneak out of the basement one night, to be like, to turn off the Netflix binge and slime his way over to the thing and hit Hillary on the election day. So, when you're trying to win an election, you'll do anything possible. And that's including sending John Podesta out to try to round up UFO votes.
That makes a lot of sense. I can't deny it. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Come on, if they're going to send around vans for homeless people, they're going to troll for the conspiracy theory guys. So.
That's right.
We were talking about skeptics, and just a couple more things on it. We really went into it last week when we had our conversation with Mike Cleland and Robbie Graham from UFOs Reframing the Debate. And skepticism is, I think it's so important because, like, it's too easy to want to believe all this stuff.
Yeah.
And, you think about, like, we all know Don Schmidt. We're friends with him. He's a really nice guy. But that Roswell slides business, get out of, like, you got to get out of town. You got to get, like, out of town. Like, you have to spend 6 months feeling bad, and then you can come back.
And exile. You were going to exile Don Schmidt.
And the thing is, I think about, who else was there was Richard Dolan. I didn't know Richard Dolan was there. And we just met Richard Dolan last year. I'm like, Richard Dolan's a cool guy. But he was associated with that, and he never in his presentation was like, guys, Dude, I've been drinking for like 2 weeks. My wife left me. Like, I saw the slides. I had to close one eye, and it looked like an alien, not like a mummified baby. Like, he could have said that, and all could be forgiven. But that stuff is just...
But now he's got to go into exile.
He take a couple months off before you come back and tell everybody that the new thing you have is a smoking gun, right? And so I feel like skepticism is so important because it needs to be kept in check. Because otherwise people will take advantage of people who want to believe all the time. And it's up to people like us to make sure that people don't get taken advantage of.
Well, Mike, I just got to say, it's burning in me. So I got to say that,
I see you're on fire.
Here it comes.
Mark was saying before, Mark, you were saying that, a lot of times the explanations of, or, the dismissals of so-called skeptics, also don't make any sense. So, I mean, both sides need to be kept in check. That's why it's so compelling when you talk about the swamp gas case, how Dr. Hynek, he was like right in the middle and just exploring that, like how difficult that is to actually stand your ground in the middle when both sides hate you. But that seems to be the right road to be on because, both sides have crazy ideas. And, what is going on in our society right now, or has been, is that the people who are so-called skeptics, people just naturally think, what they say is more reliable, which is not true, which is a bias in itself. So I just think that, there's a lot to this discussion that we're having right now. Yes, we do need people with a true skeptical viewpoint. And I don't think the cynics really give us that. What would you say, Mark?
I think maybe another way of looking at it, this whole are you a skeptic thing, or are you just, do you have filters, is to just say we just need to raise the bar higher. We need to have a higher threshold of credibility. We have to look at, like you said, the next smoking gun. I think we need to be very skeptical of anyone who says they have a smoking gun based on past experience. I think that kind of labeling smoking gun is, like, for me, that's just a red flag. That's not something you're excited about. That's a red flag for me.
That's marketing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, good point. And I'm also reminded of something that Hynek had said in '66, shortly after the swamp gas fiasco. He appeared on a CBS TV news special hosted by Walter Cronkite, and he did an interview with one of the news people, and the interviewer keeps on trying to needle Hynek about aliens and spaceships coming from other planets, and he keeps trying to bait Hynek into talking about aliens and spaceships. And Hynek won't bite, and he won't bite, and he won't bite. And finally, at the end of the interview, Hynek says, "Look, I don't have a problem with anyone saying that UFOs are spaceships from another planet with aliens in them, but the burden of proof is on them. Simple as that. Fine, you can throw any theory out there you want, but then, put your money where your mouth is."
I think that's a great move into the next area where we're saying Dr. Hynek on CBS. Now, you've had to do a lot of media lately, and there's been a whole bunch of paranormal people, a whole bunch of like podcasts and aliens and stuff like that, but it's also you've had to deal with the straights.
Straights.
Right? You had to deal with regular media. You had to deal with people who like we take paranormal stuff and we're like, and we're even tongue in cheek here. We're still pretty serious about it as compared to other places on the internet. And we even keep it kind of fun. But a lot of those places, like you go on a national radio station or a morning zoo somewhere, and they're going to be like, okay, Kim Kardashian, and whatever's happening in The Bachelor in Paradise, and we got a guy who wrote a book on UFOs. All right. So, when you were dealing with the lamestream media, when you were dealing with those people, was it fun? Was it respectful? Did anybody ask any questions? Did they treat you like you were crazy? Like, I'd like to hear a little bit about that when you have to, like Dr. Hynek, they kept on trying to bait him because they wanted to get a quote. The quote would be the head of the Air Force's Project Blue Book all of a sudden says aliens are real, and they just want that quote for the headline. Did you experience any of that?
It's been a really interesting experience because I will tell you honestly, the one media event appearance that I was most nervous about was Coast to Coast AM. I wasn't worried about any of these morning zoo DJs or any of the interviews I've done. I haven't really been worried about them because I just assumed that they would just be interested people. And for the most part, that's proven to be absolutely true. I was nervous about Coast to Coast AM because, I know that I'm taking some heretical stances in my book, and I just was kind of expecting that I would get a lot of flack, if not from George Knapp. I wasn't necessarily expecting it from Mr. Knapp, but definitely from callers. If you opened up the phone lines, I just assumed that I would get some people challenging me on things, and I wasn't really looking forward to that because those kinds of things can get uncomfortable. They can even get a little nasty. But I have to say, my worst fears proved to be completely groundless. Every media experience I've had over the past week and a half or 2 weeks, whatever it's been, every one has really been positive. People approach it differently, but I would say I haven't had a single interview where the hosts or the interviewers were trying to catch me in something or trying to make me look stupid. Or where they made fun of UFOs or UFO witnesses or any of that. I haven't encountered any of that.
Well, we still have a few minutes to change that.
Okay, do your worst, man. Do your worst. And it varies. Like when I did the Bill and Wendy show, which I was surprised it wasn't the same Wendy. Wendy, I thought. Just kidding.
There's only one of them.
Who's taking my name?
Could be only one.
They travel from place to place. They all have to dye their hair red.
So last Friday I do the Bill and Wendy show on WGN Radio, and their approach is similar to yours. Okay, they take a pretty lighthearted approach to it. They like to have fun. And so they just were having fun with the interview, and I had fun. And at one point they asked me something about alien implants. And so I started, and I mentioned, hey, there's this doctor, and Allison, you sent me that press release. Thank you for that.
Oh yeah.
And I said, there's this.
Unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
Yeah, there's this guy who specialized in removing alien implants, and sure enough, when they opened the phone lines, the first caller is this woman who says, yeah, I think I had a UFO experience in my past because a while back I injured my foot, and when they x-rayed my foot, they found that there's a needle inside my ankle. And then she sent an image of the x-ray to Bill and Wendy, and they actually have it. We're all looking at this image, this x-ray of a human foot with a needle stuck in, sort of. It was crazy, and I just had to say, you know what, this is above my pay grade. I have no idea what to say about this. I don't know what it means, but as long as the needle doesn't hurt your foot, I guess it's okay.
In this research, and you're talking about things above your pay grade and stuff like that, did you come in with a certain notion about Dr. Hynek or a certain notion about the field in general before you wrote the book? And then after the years-long process of finishing the book, What do you think changed in your perspective, changed in your opinion of the man, or how did your viewpoint as someone that's always loved this kind of stuff and been interested changed by your years of research into Dr. Hynek?
Well, there were two discoveries about Dr. Hynek, I think, that had the greatest impact on the way I viewed him as a human being and as a character in a story, which is, basically what I was treating him as. And the first thing was reading through his colleague Jacques Vallée's published journals. Vallée tells a story about how in the late 1960s, the two of them were driving to Denver to take part in the Condon Committee. They were going to testify before the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado. And they got kind of philosophical that night, driving through Denver in their rent-a-car. And Dr. Hynek starts telling Dr. Vallée that the reason he wanted to become a scientist was to explore the fringes of science. He wanted to investigate the things that science couldn't explain. And they went on to have this really interesting heart-to-heart conversation about their spiritual beliefs and how they were both interested in the Rosicrucians. Dr. Hynek talked about Rudolf Steiner, who was a really famous spiritualist who believed that there was another dimension next to ours that we could visit if we only learned the knack. We could visit this other dimension, and we could visit with, people beyond the grave, and we could visit with spiritual entities. So learning that Dr. Hynek had this really pronounced spiritual bent to him, that was a big eye-opener. That helped me understand who the guy was. But the other big thing was researching at the archives at Northwestern University, where Hynek taught for about 25 years. They have a lot of correspondence files, and I would find these files and it really started after the swamp gas case in March 1966, where his correspondence files would be just stuffed full of letters from admirers all around the country and all around the world. And they would be writing these very lengthy letters to Dr. Hynek saying, hey, I want to tell you about my UFO experience, or hey, I want to tell you about my new theory of reality. And they would send these really long, wordy, sometimes a little scary letters to Dr. Hynek. Right. And Dr. Hynek and his assistant at the time, Bill Powers, they also had copies of their responses to these people. And the responses they wrote back were equally long and detailed and very thoughtful and very respectful. They would write back to these people and say, well, now about this point you made on page 3, let's look at that. Here's what I think about that. So I'm reading through these letters and thinking, oh my gosh, how did they remain so patient and so respectful and kind to these people who really sent them, in some cases, some kind of strange letters with kind of strange ideas? Well, I couldn't ask Hynek about it, but I did have a chance to talk to Bill Powers before he passed away. And I brought this up with him, and he just kind of chuckled and he said, well, Ellen and I both believe that as long as somebody had an idea to share or an experience to talk about, they deserve to be listened to. And I just thought, wow, that's kind of beautiful, you guys.
I love that.
Yeah, I thought it was very profound, and I kind of used that as my guiding principle in telling the story in the book. So those are you asked about, sort of defining points where I really understood who Hynek was. Those are the two big moments.
And so it seems like, that I hope there's somebody out there still doing things like that, still responding in such a gentlemanly manner. And it seems like
he's probably doing it on Twitter.
Oh, wow.
Well, the thing is, Allison, there's nobody to write those letters to these days. That's the problem.
No, right?
Except Giorgio.
Well, I wonder if you wrote Giorgio, would he have that same level of depth and respect and
who knows?
Collaboration that was shown by Hynek and his assistant? And it really was something there.
Yeah,
I doubt you could see the ink past the hair gel on whatever he sent you.
Well, and it seems to me that when you think of like Giorgio Tsoukalos, and you think of all of that, like how the media covers it, or how it's popularized. I mean, maybe it's we've been taken away from dealing with things in a scientific manner. Back in the day, there was more room for thought, perhaps. And now it's just all hype. I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Wendy?
Oh, I was just going to mention that just the way that you described their approach to responding to everybody, and not ignoring people who might seem a little out there or maybe not so polite. It reminded me a lot of the Art Bell approach.
Oh, yeah.
Listen to everybody very carefully, and he was always really respectful. You never got a feeling that he was kind of like rolling his eyes or laughing at anyone, even when they, you might wonder if it was somebody acting or somebody with some issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
And that's one thing I always loved about Art Bell was because his responses of being so respectful and interested and, regardless of the tone or the way the information was presented, it made you actually seriously consider it and maybe consider some things that you might not have otherwise encountered or heard or, looked at before. So
yeah, that's the genius of the guy. Definitely.
Yeah.
But what a drama queen. Every time, every time he comes back in the air, then all of a sudden, they're shooting at my house. And he's like,
it's art. Come on.
I have to leave the air, but I can't, but I can't tell you about it. And when the time is right, you'll know. You'll see my name in the sky. I love Art Bell too, and he was the best.
But the other thing
give me a break.
Yeah, the other thing is so Art listened, but the difference in what I'm hearing you say, Mark, is that Dr. Hynek, in his responses, it sounds like, he wasn't like, oh, well, whatever you believe. I mean, he was really digging down into what they said and giving an honest assessment, whether it probably said to them that, this was something that was explainable, in astronomy terms or something like that, or whether it was, no, that really is something we need to look into. So, I think that's the level of rigor is the difference with Hynek, because it's not just listening, it's also responding in a way that shows you're interested in really, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's not just hold this up for entertainment. No, we're really interested in figuring out what's going on. And that's what I think we've lost, unfortunately, in this culture that we have today.
Yeah, well, we talked before about how when he started out working for Project Blue Book, it was just sitting at a desk with a stack of papers in front of him, with all these UFO reports that he would have to go through one by one. And that was sort of his whole involvement for the first few years. But then in 1952 or 53, I guess, for the first time, instead of just sitting behind a desk, he actually got sent out to South Dakota and North Dakota to do his first field investigation. And I think that had a big, big effect on the way Hynek approached not just the UFO phenomenon, but approached UFO witnesses. Because all of a sudden, for the first time, he's talking face to face. And in this North Dakota, South Dakota case, there were a lot of witnesses, and they were all sorts of different kinds of people. They were military people, control tower operators, pilots, ground observers, people with all sorts of different levels of education and experience. And for the first time ever, Hynek's dealing with them face to face. And I think that case and the cases that came soon after that really had a big effect on him and how he treated people. Because it was right around that same time that he was giving an address to a gathering of scientists in Boston, the American Optical Society, and they had already had two speakers get up on stage and deliver papers basically making fun of UFOs and making fun of UFO witnesses. And then Hynek gets up to give his talk, and he makes this great statement, and he says, look, ridicule is not part of the scientific method, and the American people shouldn't be taught that it is. And that became his operating principle throughout the rest of his career.
Cool.
Wow, I love that.
Well, that's an awesome story. And speaking of stories, we have a couple more questions for you, Mark, and thank you for being generous with your time. When obviously probably the last thing you want to do after talking about J. Allen Hynek for hours and hours straight is to keep continuing to talk about J. Allen Hynek. But speaking of stories, when you were prepping for your media blitz, okay, you probably prepped some stories. You're like, okay, so I can get them off the cuff and so I can knock them out. Did you prepare anything that nobody asked you about and you didn't have a chance to finally tell a story or an anecdote, What is that anecdote? Because we would like to hear it.
Well, there are a couple things. There are a couple of surprises. There are a couple things later in the book that I thought would be big surprises to UFO enthusiasts. And so far, nobody has mentioned any of them. And I'm not sure if it's because they just haven't gotten that far in the book or what. But the two big things I was so excited about because these were like my big scoops in my book. Number one was, so we talked about the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And there was a character in that movie who was a French scientist, played in the movie by Francois Truffaut. And UFO lore says that character was modeled after Dr. Jacques Vallée, who was Dr. Hynek's friend and colleague for many, many years. Well, I found out that that's absolutely not true. People have been saying that for 40 years now since the movie came out. Spielberg has never commented on it publicly that I'm aware of. But I found a statement by Hynek where he said, no, that character was actually based on a French astronomer named Claude Poher, who Hynek had some dealings with. Claude Poher was also an astronomer who turned into a UFO researcher. So that was one big thing. I thought that would be making heads explode. What? It wasn't Jacques Vallée?
But that blew
You
my
made
mind.
my head explode.
Because that's like, talk about great marketing. You can be like, oh yeah, well, Steven Spielberg modeled the character after this guy.
Right.
You gotta have to buy his book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think we can work on that. The other big surprise was there's this, a big chapter late in Hynek's life where he and his wife moved down to Arizona. They left Chicago and moved down to Scottsdale, Arizona. And the plan was to open up sort of a Western subsidiary of his Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And the whole thing, there were these two gold mining entrepreneurs, Tina Choate and Brian Myers, who kind of talked Hynek into moving to Arizona. And they had a millionaire friend who was going to finance this huge UFO research center in Scottsdale. Well, those plans all fell through. There were a lot of hard feelings. Somewhere along the line, some valuable UFO case files went missing, and a lot of people were pointing their fingers at Brian and Tina and saying, well, they had something to do with it, but I don't think anything's ever been proven. Upshot of this is these two people, Brian and Tina, have not spoken to anyone in the UFO community for over 30 years. Because they felt like they had targets painted on their backs. And so they just weren't going to open themselves up to that. Well, and people I talked to when I was researching the book, I would ask people, how to get a hold of Brian and Tina. And they would say, oh, don't even bother. They're not going to talk. Even if you can find them, they're never going to talk to you because it's such a sore subject. Well, and then I found them. I found them last summer, just about a year ago. And they were just the nicest people, and they actually really wanted to talk about this experience. They weren't sure if they could trust me at first, so we spent about 3 or 4 hours on the phone before they even agreed to let me record the conversation and interview them.
When they did that, what was their litmus test? Were they like, what were your parents like? What are your kids like? What do you like to do? Are you a Brewers fan?
They just basically wanted to know my point of view in the Hynek story, and I just said, I'm just trying to tell Hynek's life story. I'm trying to understand, what brought him to Arizona. What was his experience like here? I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody or accuse anybody of anything. That's not what this book is about. I'm just trying to understand Dr. Hynek. And the thing is, Brian and Tina, what became very clear to me very quickly was that Brian and Tina had an immense amount of affection for Dr. Hynek. They really treasured their time working with him, even though things didn't work out well in the end. They still treasured the experience of having known him and having worked with him. So that was kind of what I tried to stick with. So that was the other thing. I also thought that there would be heads exploding over the fact that I actually talked to Brian and Tina, but I'm still waiting for a head to explode.
All right. Well, I think I heard a head explode in the other room. Right there. So
Finally.
It was a bomb that went off.
Yeah, there was a slight pop.
But so they didn't steal any UFO files. They liked them. No UFO files got stolen. Were they experiencers themselves?
Yeah, actually, that's how they first got to know Dr. Hynek, was that Tina had seen a UFO, and a friend said, "Oh, you should talk to this guy I know, J. Allen Hynek. He just happens to be in Phoenix right now for some work thing." So she got together, met with him, told him about her experience, and they struck up a friendship, and that's how the whole thing got started. And to in Hynek's final days, he was eternally grateful to Tina Choate for getting him out of Chicago and getting him away from Chicago winters, so that he could at least spend his retirement years in the sunshine in Scottsdale.
That's something that skeptics and believers can agree on.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
We all like the sun.
Right.
Well, so Mark, I've read an article in the Skeptical Inquirer about Hynek, saying that there's this secret history of him, and it basically was about the Rudolf Steiner stuff and the Rosicrucian stuff, and intimating that you can't have spiritual beliefs and be a skeptic at the same time.
Yeah.
It's essentially what they're saying there. So, to me, that's like, what? You can't go to church? You can't, you have to be completely an atheist to be a skeptic? We have to be skeptical of the skeptics as well. So what would you say about that, Mark?
That was one of the first articles I read when I started researching this book, because as I recall, it was published around 2011 or 2012. And it was right when I was starting to really dig into Hynek's life. So I saw that article and thought, aha, I've got to read that. And yeah, I ended up just scratching my head at the end of that article, because I just thought the argument they're making makes absolutely no sense to me. It's like, not only is it what you said, that you can't have spiritual beliefs and be a rational scientist at the same time, that article also, to me, seemed to be making the case that if you change your mind about your beliefs, you must be a phony. And I just thought that was it's just so insulting to the reader and to Dr. Hynek. I just think that's a nonsense argument. That was my takeaway from that article. I just thought, I'm not sure what you were trying to prove, but I don't think you proved it very well.
Well, and to the research process in itself, because how does anybody start out with all the right answers? That's implausible. If you are doing research, if you are really reading and thinking and going out there and doing field investigations, then your mind is going to change, because you start out not knowing. You start out with misconceptions. I'm a 4th grade teacher, and we teach this in our inquiry circles, where, if your mind is changing, that is evidence of synthesis. That is evidence of learning. So, don't hide that. That's a beautiful thing, that you thought one thing and then you did some legwork, and lo and behold, your thinking changed. Yeah. That means you have a mind and you know how to use it.
Well, did Dr. Hynek, when you said that he started off as a hardcore, that he was just there to debunk, when he moved from debunker to an open mind, was there a particular case that changed his mind? Was it the North and South Dakota, when he talked to somebody and he's like, oh man, I'm looking her in the eye and I don't think she's lying. And then you're like, you old softy, you got to be tougher. You're part of the Air Force now, son.
Just the facts, ma'am.
I think that was one of the cases that kind of started his thinking. There was another episode right about that same time where when he came back to work for the Air Force a second time, he was sent out on this sort of spy mission to survey professional astronomers and find out what his colleagues thought about UFOs. So he went to an astronomers convention. He sort of crisscrossed the country and the West Coast, went to all these major observatories, and just sort of subtly brought up the topic of UFOs with his colleagues when he would meet with them. And what he found was that about 11% of the astronomers that he talked to were willing to say that they had seen a UFO. And that's it's 11 out of 45 astronomers. That's a pretty good. Wait, maybe it's 11%. Maybe it's not 11 sightings. Maybe it's 11%. Strike that. I think I may have gotten that wrong. But at any rate, the percentage of astronomers, I have so many numbers in my head, guys. I'm sorry. I don't always remember.
No problem.
That's okay.
But the number of astronomers, professional astronomers who were willing to say, yes, I've seen a UFO, and then the number of astronomers who also were willing to say, I haven't seen a UFO, but I think it's an interesting problem and I think it's worth studying. The numbers of those people who would admit to those two things were high enough that Hynek started thinking, aha, I've got some intellectual cover here. There are other scientists who think that this is worth looking into. So that kind of started that whole train of thought too. But I wanted to mention one story from, at one point I interviewed a guy named Frank Reed, who was basically the archivist and librarian for Dr. Hynek's Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And he had a great line about Dr. Hynek. He said, Dr. Hynek's views on UFOs vacillated from day to day and sometimes from hour to hour. But he said, I took that as proof of Dr. Hynek's scientific integrity. And I thought, well, that pretty much sums it all up right there. I thought that was an incredibly insightful observation about Hynek.
Well, you keep your mind open when it comes to these kind of things, especially when you have to, deal with the people who've had these experiences. And if you're too, believing, then you open yourself up to be discredited. But if you're too harsh, then you're not going to get the real stories from people because they're not going to open up to you.
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like the Close Encounters man was an awesome guy, and I wish I could have met him. I'm jealous of Lloyd Auerbach, one of my paranormal role models, because he got interested in the whole thing because he was J. Allen Hynek's student at Northwestern. He's like, that's when I got to think that maybe, this stuff is real. And
and we weren't far away. We were in the Midwest with Hynek.
We were 75 minutes away.
We could have known him, and we could have known each other too, and we could have started that Scooby gang that I talked about. It's just like so many lost opportunities.
Yeah.
So you guys don't know that Mark grew up in the same town as Allison and I did.
A very small town
1,000
called
people.
Big Bend.
Yeah,
Big Bend, Wisconsin.
1,000 people right out a southeastern suburb of Milwaukee. And Wendy grew up on the north side too, so we could have jumped in the Scooby van and gone and picked her up. But we do have a Scooby van now, so now we can do it.
Yes,
well, I want to join you sometime.
We'll make up for last time.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to join
Mark,
you
you have to
sometime
come
on
up to-
Scooby Van.
You're going to have to jump in the Scooby van. We'll go to a paranormal convention.
Yeah.
And we can hang out at the See You on the Other Side booth.
Yeah, I'm there. Let's do it.
Awesome.
Speaking of conventions, we're recording this before the Haunted America Convention in Alton, Illinois. But next week, we're going to have a recap of that. So look out for that in the next episode. But right now, what we want to tell people is where they can pick up a copy of Close Encounters Man for themselves. We've been talking about it for the past hour, and I know they're going to want to read this book. And so go to your Amazon, go to your Kindle, go to wherever you go to buy books. Go to your local bookseller if you believe in paper and want to kill trees. I love killing trees.
Trees, they're asking for it all the time.
But buy the Close. This is the next UFO book you should buy. Because it's a really interesting study of a man, and it's a balanced biography, and it's written by our friend. So where can they get it?
Well, you had it right. They can get it at Amazon. They can get it at any bookseller, big chains like Barnes and Nobles or independent booksellers. It's available everywhere, all over the country. The day the book came out, I got my little brother who lives in Boise, Idaho, sent me a picture of him holding up the book. Just like that.
Hey!
Awesome.
At the Barnes and Nobles in Boise. So if it's in Boise,
cool.
It's everywhere.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
All right. If they get it, they sell it right next to the potatoes. Okay. Thank you again for joining us, Mark. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Everybody, if you want to get a direct link right after this, othersidepodcast.com/150 is going to have a link where you can pick up the book. It's going to have a link to Mark's UFO blog, and you can learn more, and plus a link to our past episodes with him, so you can pick up on that as well, because I know now that you got the 101, you're going to need the 201 and the 301, so you can become experts. So once again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Allison from Milwaukee Ghosts.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you both
Thank
again.
you, Allison. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Wendy. It was fun, as always.
All right.
Indeed.
Absolutely. And now let's go sneak to the song of the week.
One of the most important aspects of Hynek's impact on ufology was how his beliefs evolved over time. He followed the evidence where it led without preconceived notions, which is one of the reasons we're still talking about him today. Evolution isn't easy, and adjusting your beliefs, whether it be about yourself or the universe, when you discover new truths, isn't easy. And some people can never change. That's what this week's Sunspot song, Archaeopteryx, is about. The dinosaur with feathers, we think of the Archaeopteryx as the link between those cold-blooded monsters and our modern birds, and how it sucks to be stuck in the middle, belonging to neither generation. The key line is evolve or die. That's how natural selection works, and that's how science works. If you aren't willing to change, then you are willing to go extinct. Here it is, Archaeopteryx by Sunspot.
I'm lost in time, a relic of some forgotten past. Where is my kind? I guess that they just couldn't last. A reproductive dead end, just more carbon left to waste. Another life form couldn't keep up in the race. I missed out on the golden age. Too young to fit in and too old for this decade. Anyway, alive oxymoron, like an unexploded bomb. An unwelcome guest who never knew where he belonged. In this godforsaken bed, it's just survival of the fit. There is no why, evolve or die, Archaeopteryx. Adapt to be selected against, but don't get left behind. The march of progress has a very tight deadline. I missed out on the golden age. Too young to fit in and too old for this decade. Anyway, alive oxymoron, like an unexploded bomb. An unwelcome guest who never knew where he belonged. In this godforsaken bed, it's just survival of the fit. There is no why, evolve or die, Archaeopteryx. And all you boomers and the world that you screwed up, I want to eat you like a titan, beat you like I'm Tyson. And you millennials who never will shut up, make me wish that Y2K flushed you all away. And all you boomers and the world that you screwed up, I want to eat you like a titan, beat you like I'm Tyson. And you millennials who never can shut up, make me wish that Y2K flushed you all away. My kind goes extinct. Alive oxymoron, like an unexploded bomb. An unwelcome guest who never
thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Hey. Just another thank you for tuning in and listening today. And a huge shout out to our Patreon, Ned, who is contributing at a level where he gets a shout out every single episode. Special thanks to all of our Patreons for kicking in a little bit each month, making it possible for us to continue doing all of this fun stuff. You can join the community by visiting OthersidePodcast.com/donate. We've got our Patreon hangout coming up this week, and I'm very excited because we have a lot to talk about. It's Thursday, June 29th at 7 p.m. Central Time on Google Hangouts. So if you are one of our contributors, please join us. We'd love to talk to you. And thanks to every single one of you for tuning in. We look forward to talking to you next week. Cheers.
What you saw was the planet Venus.